Hello again, my friends. How nice it is to have you back in our quiet corner. I do hope the world has been treating you kindly. The other day, I was visiting a small village in the Cotswolds. Stowe, it's called, a very nice place indeed. Well, down a quiet lane, there was a shop selling the most beautiful tapestries. I was captivated by one that depicted the Tree of Life. It was incredibly detailed, from the thick, lush canopy right down to the roots. By the base of the tree sat 3 delightfully small field mice. They were woven into the scene for eternity. But I asked myself, I wonder what would happen if the mice decided to go for a walk. And that's why I wrote tonight's story. I hope you like it. Now sit back, let the tension of the day flow out of your flat, open hands, and relax. The late August afternoon was particularly drowsy, filled with the low, heavy drone of bumblebees lolloping their way through the tangled blackberry brambles that bordered the mill stream. Inside her timber-framed cottage, tucked behind the old stone mill, Marigold Mixtint was engaged in the quiet, methodical business of sorting her studio. The air in the room was a delightful, thick blend of creative industry. It smelled faintly of pressed linseed oil, the sharp tang of dried walnut hulls, bundles of lavender hanging from the low oak rafters, and a sweet, dusty scent of old parchment. Marigold's studio was a masterpiece of organised muddle. Along the northern wall stood rows of tiny earthen jars, each sealed with a bit of oiled canvas and twine, containing the powdered pigments she collected from the valley's secret places. Crushed yellow weld from the high limestone scarps, rich red ochre dug from the banks of the Iron Brook, and deep indigo blocks brought by the winter pack horses. Great wicker baskets overflowed with skeins of wool dyed in small copper vats over her hearth, using elderberries, wild marjoram, and gorse blossoms. On the main wall, framed in dark, polished crabapple wood that had been rubbed with beeswax until it shone like glass, hung her finest work, a magnificent tapestry known throughout the parish as the Summer Meadow of Willowbrook. It was a vast, intricate weaving, executed upon a heavy linen warp, using the softest, most delicate, moon-ripened alpaca threads. The picture was a celebration of midsummer abundance, showing a dense, tangled cornfield where the golden ears of wheat bowed under their own weight, interspersed with vivid scarlet poppies and bright blue cornflowers that seemed to shimmer in the shifting light of the room. Marigold adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles, leaning closer to the frame with a bone needle held between her paws. She had intended to tighten a loose loop of green silk near the bottom corner where the wild parsley was woven. But as her eyes travelled down to the base of the grand dock leaf that anchored the left side of the composition, her paws went entirely still. The bone needle slipped from her grip, falling with a faint rattle against the floorboards. The 3 field mice, who usually inhabited that corner of the woven field, were gone. They had not been moth-eaten. The threads had not snapped or unravelled into a tangle of loose fringe. Instead, where the 3 plump, chestnut-coloured mice usually sat, one nibbling on a fallen grain of wheat, one looking out at the viewer with bright, black thread eyes, and one curled in a sleepy circle, there were now 3 perfect blank silhouettes of raw, undyed cream linen grid. It looked precisely as though the little creatures had simply stood up, stepped forward, and walked right out of their background, leaving their empty spaces behind like clean footprints left in the morning frost. "Oh my word," Marigold whispered, her nose twitching in absolute breathless astonishment. She dropped to her knees, heedless of the dust, and began a meticulous search of the immediate area. She peered beneath the heavy legs of her oak trestle table. She shifted the large stone jars of powdered chalk. She checked the narrow gap behind her spinning wheel. She even inspected the tiny groove where the floorboards met the wainscoting. But the studio was completely, perfectly still. The only movement was the lazy dancing of gold dust boats in the long shafts of afternoon sunlight that filtered through the high leaded window panes. The empty cream shapes in the tapestry seemed to stare back at her, flat and silent. The mice had vanished, taking their chestnut coats and pink-stitched ears completely out of the story. A quarter-mile down the lane, where the hedgerows grew thick and high, stood Rosehip Cottage. It was a long, low house built of field stones and covered in a thick, shaggy thatch that had turned the colour of ginger biscuits over the years. Inside the large kitchen was the very heart of domestic comfort, and this afternoon it was filled with the soothing sounds of 4 friends at work. The long scrubbed oak table was nearly covered in the bounty of the late summer fields. Rosco was sitting on a low wooden bench at one end, his feet tucked neatly beneath him and his long ears tossing cheerfully as he worked. He was using a small brass awl to repair the split willow lid of a large harvest basket, his movements slow and deliberate, as he threaded the thick hemp twine through the stubborn wood. Beside him sat Berry, his dark eyes focused with intense concentration as he sorted through a shallow wooden tray of dried sunflower seeds, selecting only the plumpest, striped hulls to save for the winter planting bags. At the large hearth, where a small fire burned with a steady, lazy orange eye, Millie Moonbeam was in her absolute element. Her apron was always immaculately white, smelling faintly of dried woodruff, and her long ears were currently tucked neatly back under a linen cap to keep them out of the steam. With a long-handled wooden spoon, she was slowly stirring a small copper basin of wild plum jam, the rich crimson bubbles popping and filling the entire kitchen with a deep, honeyed aroma. Carrotina sat on the hearthrug near Millie Moonbeam's feet, her paws moving in a swift, hypnotic rhythm as she carded a basket of raw sheep's wool, transforming the tangled grey fleece into smooth, cloud-like rolls, ready for the spinning wheel. The heavy latch of the kitchen door gave a sudden, clattering lift, and Marigold Mixtint burst into the room. Her bonnet was slightly askew, and her whiskers were trembling with a mixture of breathlessness and bewilderment. In her paw she clutched a small sheet of scrap parchment. "Rosco, Millie Moonbeam," Marigold cried, leaning against the doorpost to catch her breath. "The most extraordinary thing has occurred at the mill house. The tapestry, the summer meadow, it has emptied itself." Millie Moonbeam instantly set her wooden spoon across the rim of the copper basin, her kind face turning toward her friend with immediate concern. "My dear Marigold, sit down at once. You are a-flustered, and look like you've had a fine doing of. Berry, fetch the pitcher of cold mint water from the dairy pantry." Rosco laid his awl aside on the table, his ears rising with curiosity. "Emptied itself, you say? Has the backing rotted out, Marigold? I told you that north wall gets a bit damp when the autumn mists start coming off the mill pond." No, it isn't damp," Marigold insisted, taking the cool clay cup that Berry gently pressed into her paw. She drank 3 long, grateful swallows before spreading the parchment flat upon the oak table. "Look here, I have drawn it exactly as it appears." The 4 friends gathered closely around the sketch. It showed the familiar corner of the dock leaf, but within the pencil lines, Marigold had carefully shaded 3 distinct, empty white shapes. "They've walked," Carrotina whispered, her fingers tracing the edge of the sketch. "Those are the silhouettes of the field mice. The warp is entirely intact, but the weft, the coloured alpaca wool, is completely missing. It's as if the design has simply unfastened itself from the linen." Rosco leaned his chin on his paws, his nose twitching a whiskerful twitch as he studied the drawings. "I remember my great-uncle speaking of the old hill weavings," he said. "The weaver folk who lived in the high limestone dales 50 years ago didn't use common dyes. They gathered their plants by the phases of the moon, wild weld at the full moon for the yellow, and madder roots under a dark sky for the red. They said the wool retained a bit of the field's memory. If the nights have turned crisp this week, those little woven fellows might well have felt the first whisper of autumn coming through the window." "Of course," Millie Moonbeam exclaimed, her eyes lighting up as she moved the kettle onto the hot iron ring of the stove. "A woven mouse is still a mouse in its heart. If it senses the summer ending, its very first thought will be to prepare for the cold months. They haven't run away out of mischief, Marigold. They've gone to forage for their winter nest." "But where could they go in a studio?" Berry asked, looking down at his paws. "They're flat, 2-dimensional creatures. They cannot climb a real cupboard or dig in a real grain bin." "They won't be looking for real food," Carrotina explained, her creative mind instantly grasping the fairytale logic of the situation. "Real oats would be too heavy, and real cheese would ruin their wool. They will be looking for things that fit the picture, things that look like treasures when seen from a mouse's height." Rosco stood up and walked over to the dresser drawer. Then we must go and help them find what they need. If they stay out of the tapestry too long into the night, the room will grow cold and their moon-dyed colours might fade into the wood grain of the floor. Let us finish our tea, pack our small lanterns, and make ready for a night watch at the mill." Millie Moonbeam nodded, her cap strings bobbing as she deftly poured the hot clover tea into 5 matching earthenware mugs. "We must bring them some offerings," she said, her practical domestic wisdom guiding her hand. "Things that are small, light, and beautiful enough to be woven into an eternal summer field." The sun had completely dipped behind the high, craggy limestone ridges of the valley by the time the 5 friends left Rosehip Cottage. The twilight was a deep, velvet plum colour, and the air had grown pleasantly cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed fern and the damp mist rising from the water meadows. They walked in a slow, single file down the narrow, winding lane that led toward the old mill, their path illuminated by the soft, warm glow of 3 small lanterns carried by Rosco, Berry, and Millie Moonbeam. Each lantern was a beautiful piece of country craft, its tin frame pierced with tiny star-shaped holes that cast dancing patterns of light across the high stone walls by the hedgerow. Rosco carried a small oak toolbox, though tonight it held no chisels or nails, only a collection of soft velvet cloths and a small jar of refined beeswax polish. Beside him, Millie Moonbeam walked with careful steps, ensuring the covered willow basket in her paws remained perfectly level. Inside the basket, nested in layers of soft tissue paper, were the treasures they had gathered from the cottage drawers. They had spent an hour choosing items that possessed the perfect quality for a moon-dyed weaving. Millie Moonbeam had contributed a small cluster of dried elderfluff, which looked precisely like a tiny snow-white cloud. Carrotina had found 3 translucent, hollow seed pods from the wild honesty plant, which shimmered like silver coins in the lantern light. And Berry had added a small wall of fossilized snail shell he had found in the brook, its stone surface patterned with a perfect sleepy spiral. When they reached the mill cottage, the great wooden wheel was silent, the dark water of the mill pond lapping sleepily against the mossy paddles. Inside Marigold's studio, the shadows had grown long and dense, pooling under the heavy legs of the oak trestle table and behind the wicker baskets of wool. The magnificent tapestry framed in crabapple wood looked dark and mysterious in the starlight, its 3 empty cream silhouettes standing out like tiny pale ghosts in the golden field. "Set the lanterns on the low stools," Rosco instructed softly. "We must keep the light low and steady. If we shine the lanterns directly on the floor, we might startle them back into the shadows." Berry and Carrotina knelt down together on the braided rag rug directly beneath the tapestry. Moving with slow, gentle movements, they cleared away a small space on the floorboards. Carrotina unfolded Millie Moonbeam's velvet handkerchief, laying it perfectly flat against the dark oak wood to create a soft treasure landing. One by one they arranged their offerings upon the velvet. Berry placed the silver honesty pods in a neat triangle. Moonbeam nestled a cloud-like elderfluff in the centre, and Carrotina set out a single, brilliant gold sequin she had borrowed from Marigold's sewing box. "Now," Moonbeam whispered, her voice dropping into a comforting, rhythmic lullaby tone as she sat cross-legged on the rug, her linen apron rustling softly. "We must sit as still as the stones in the wall. Woven creatures move by the rhythm of the house. If the house is restless, they will remain hidden." The 5 friends arranged themselves in a peaceful circle around the landing cloth. The studio settled into a deep, luxurious silence. The only sound within the timbered walls was the patient ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, and the soft, sleepy sighing of the August wind through the larch trees outside. They waited, their eyes adjusting to the soft starlight, letting the profound tranquility of the night wrap around them like a thick woolen blanket. An hour passed in absolute stillness, the shadows in the corners of the studio remaining perfectly parked. Then, just as the moon rose high enough to cast a long silver spear of light through the leaded window panes, Moonbeam's long ears gave a gentle, silent twitch. From the deep shadow beneath Marigold's spinning wheel, a sound arose. It was not the sharp, hurried scratch of real field mice running across the wood. It was a sound infinitely softer, like 2 pieces of fine, dry tissue paper sliding gently over one another, or the whisper of silk ribbons being drawn through a comb. Out into the bright square of moonlight stepped 3 tiny, flat shapes. They were utterly beautiful, moving with a charming 2-dimensional grace. They were completely flat, woven from the finest chestnut-coloured wool, with tiny pink thread knots for their noses and delicate looped stitch tails that trailed behind them like fine pieces of string. Because they had no thickness, they glided smoothly over the ridges and imperfections of the old oak floorboards, their flat profiles casting no shadows of their own. The first little mouse, whose woven coat was patterned with a tiny cream stripe down his back, glided straight toward the velvet handkerchief. He paused at the edge, his stitched whiskers twitching in the starlight, and looked down at the silver honesty pods. With a sudden flat leap, he hopped onto the velvet, his paws grasping the edge of a pod. He began to nudge it forward, puffing out his flat chest as he rolled the silver disc across the cloth. The other 2 mice worked as a pair. They had discovered the gold sequin. Together, their flat pink paws gripped the shiny metal, their 2-dimensional bodies tilting backward as they dragged the heavy, shimmering sun across the floorboards toward the base of the wall. "They're trying to carry them up to the frame," Berry whispered, his voice so low it barely carried across the circle. "But they can't climb the plaster," Carrotina murmured, her eyes wide with sympathy. "Look at them. The wall is too steep for a flat paw to grip." Indeed, the little field mice had reached the heavy oak baseboard directly beneath the crabapple frame. They were pressing their flat, woven faces against the wood, their little thread tails thrashing in silent frustration as the gold sequin and the silver seed pods slid back down to the floorboards. They let out 3 tiny, high-pitched squeaks that echoed plaintively through the quiet room. Rosco leaned forward, his ears tilting down toward the floor. "They've done the hard foraging," he said softly, a warm smile touching his whiskerful nose. "It's time we lent them our paws. Millie Moonbeam, bring the needle box. Let's help our little neighbours finish their summer story." The room remained wrapped in its deep amber starlight as the friends prepared to help their tiny, flat neighbours. Marigold reached onto her shelves and retrieved her special wooden needle box, carved from a single block of sweet-scented pearwood. When she slid the lid open, it revealed rows of needles and fine hanks of invisible silk thread, spun by the valley's silkworms during the quiet month of May. "Berry, Carrotina," Rosco whispered. "You have the nimblest paws for the small things. Gently now." Berry crept forward on his hands and knees, moving with a deliberate slowness that ensured not a single floorboard creaked. He extended his right paw, flattening it completely against the dark wood, just in front of the mouse with the silver seed pod. The tiny woven creature did not run. It simply glided onto his fur, its 2-dimensional body feeling entirely weightless, like a single dried leaf caught in a gentle autumn breeze. Carrotina moved beside him, gently cupping her paws around the 2 mice who were guarding the gold sequin. Rosco stood directly behind them, holding his horn lantern steady so its star-shaped beams of light illuminated the lower edge of the crabapple frame without creating any harsh, frightening shadows. Millie Moonbeam stood by Marigold's side at the loom bench, her deft paws sorting the silver silk threads to match the weave of the linen grid. "We must align them precisely with the pale outlines," Millie Moonbeam whispered softly, her domestic focus bringing a beautiful sense of order to the magic. "If they are even a single thread askew, they won't settle comfortably into the field." One by one, Berry and Carrotina lifted the flat travellers up to the lower edge of the tapestry. The moment the woven mice touched the rough, familiar fringe of the linen warp, a wonderful transformation occurred. With a soft, rustling hush, a sound like a gentle summer breeze passing through a field of dry oats, the mice slid effortlessly back into their fabric. They glided up through the indigo cornflowers and the scarlet poppies, their flat profiles sliding perfectly into the 3 empty cream-coloured silhouettes. As they settled back into their spaces, their rich, chestnut colours instantly returned, the moon-dyed alpaca wool glowing with a soft inner warmth. But they had not left their treasures behind. Working together in perfect, quiet harmony, the 5 friends began the delicate task of stitching the real-world objects into the woven scene. Marigold threaded her needle with the silver silk, while Carrotina held the gold sequin flat against the upper corner of the linen sky. With 3 tiny invisible knots, Marigold secured the metal disc into the grid. Instantly the sequin became a permanent sun for the tapestry, catching the starlight and bathing the entire woven field in a warm golden glow. Next, Rosco gently held the dried elderfluff against the top ridge of the field. Millie Moonbeam anchored it with her needle, transforming the soft white fluff into a magnificent permanent summer cloud that floated lazily above the wheat ears. Finally, Berry guided the silver honesty pods into the corner beneath the dock leaf, where they were stitched into place as a cluster of shimmering protective bushes. The 3 field mice sat contentedly within their new, perfected home. The first mouse sat beneath the silver honesty bush, his stitched eyes looking out into the studio with absolute satisfaction. The second curled in his sleepy circle on the woven moss, warmed by the permanent gold sun above him. The third mouse rested his flat chin on a blade of green thread, completely protected from the cold autumn winds that would soon arrive in the valley outside. The tapestry was complete, altered forever in the most beautiful, whimsical way. A profound, beautiful exhaustion settled over the studio. The air smelled deeply of the dried lavender hanging from the rafters and the faint, sweet scent of the pearwood needlebox. Marigold looked up at her restored masterpiece, her wire-rimmed spectacles slipping slightly down her nose as she let out a long, happy sigh. "They are home," she murmured, her voice drifting sleepily through the room, "and they shall never be cold again." "A grand piece of work all round," Rosco said as he carried his toolbox back to the door. "But my ears tell me it's long past midnight, and the hearth at Rosehip Cottage is waiting for us." Before they departed, Millie Moonbeam insisted on a quiet moment of restoration. She fetched a small stoneware jug of elderberry wine and a plate of sweet oat biscuits from Marigold's larder. The 5 friends sat together in a quiet circle on the braided rug, sharing the simple supper in low, drowsy tones. The sweet, dark wine warmed their throats, and the crisp biscuits provided a perfect comfort after the night's quiet magic. When they finally stepped out of the mill house, the valley was completely asleep. The moon was a bright silver coin high in the velvet sky, and the mill pond was a perfect mirror, reflecting the vast canopy of stars. The 4 bunnies walked back down the winding lane toward Rosehip Cottage, their lanterns swinging in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that matched their sleepy footsteps. The lane was completely silent, wrapped in the deep, nocturnal peace of late August. Inside Rosehip Cottage, the kitchen was perfectly warm and welcoming. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a soft, glowing bed of grey ash, casting long, gentle shadows across the scrubbed oak table and pine rafters. Moving with heavy, leaden movements, the friends prepared for their rest. Rosco unlaced his boots, setting them neatly by the back door, his ears drooping with a delicious weight. Berry and Carrotina hung their waistcoats and bonnets on the wooden pegs, their movements slow in their drowsiness. Millie Moonbeam went about the room with quiet care, blowing out the small lanterns and ensuring the latch on the heavy oak door was securely fastened for the night. She climbed the small, polished wooden stairs to where 4 thick wool blankets were waiting. One by one, the 4 companions crawled into their respective beds, pulling the heavy warm covers all the way up to their chinnigans. On the mantelpiece below, the old clock measured out the quiet, patient seconds, each swing of the heavy brass pendulum slowing the house down further, carrying away the last remaining thoughts of the long day. As you let your own eyes close now, and you sink deeper into the absolute comfort and support of your own bed, let these gentle thoughts wrap around your mind, sinking in with each slow, quiet breath. My day is beautifully complete, and there is nothing left to do. My hands are perfectly still, and my thoughts are slowing down. I am surrounded by warmth, safety, and deep, quiet comfort. I give myself full permission to let go of the world outside. I am perfectly protected, and everything is taken care of. I am ready to drift into a deep, beautiful, and restful sleep. Let the slow, lazy pulse of the night carry you deeper and deeper into the quiet dark. The studio is still. The gold sun is shining in the woven sky. The little mice are sleeping under their silver bush. The entire valley is fast asleep, and you are entirely safe. All was snug. All was well. Night-night.